The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy downtown plaza as Thomas Matthews wheeled himself slowly through the crowded space. His weathered hands gripped the wheelchair's rims with practiced ease, though each push seemed to require more effort than it should. The oxygen tank attached to his chair released a soft hiss with every breath he took through the clear plastic tubes that wrapped around his ears and under his nose. Thomas had served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine, where an improvised explosive device had changed his life forever. The blast had damaged his lungs so severely that simple tasks like crossing a street now left him gasping for air. The shrapnel had also taken his ability to walk, confining him to the wheelchair that had become both his mobility and his burden. At 62 years old, Thomas tried to maintain his dignity despite the stares and whispers that often followed him. Today was no different. He had an appointment at the Veterans Affairs Office to discuss his disability benefits, which had been delayed for months due to bureaucratic red tape. The stress of fighting for the support he deserved only made his breathing problems worse. As he navigated through the plaza, Thomas noticed a group of young men in expensive suits standing near the fountain. They were clearly successful, probably in their 20s or early 30s, with polished shoes and designer watches that caught the sunlight. Their loud conversation carried across the space, filled with talk of business deals and weekend plans at exclusive clubs. One of them, a tall man with slicked-back blonde hair, noticed Thomas struggling to maneuver around a small crowd that had gathered to watch a street performer. The veteran's breathing had become more labored as he tried to find an alternative route, the oxygen tank working overtime to help his damaged lungs. "Look at that," the blonde man said to his companions, pointing directly at Thomas. "Another one of those fake veterans looking for sympathy money." His friends turned to look, and Thomas felt his face burn with embarrassment. He had encountered this kind of ignorance before, but it never got easier. People saw his relatively young age and assumed he was faking his condition for benefits or attention. "I bet he's not even a real veteran," another one of them said, this one with dark hair and a cruel smile. "Probably bought that uniform at a thrift store and rented the wheelchair." Thomas wore a simple Marine Corps t-shirt that he had earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. The shirt was faded and worn, but it represented some of the proudest moments of his life, before everything changed in that dusty Afghan road. The group began to move closer to Thomas, their voices getting louder and more mocking. Other people in the plaza started to notice the commotion, but most looked away uncomfortably rather than intervene. "Hey, fake soldier," the blonde man called out, causing Thomas to stop his wheelchair and look up. "How much money do you make pretending to be disabled? Must be a pretty good gig sitting around all day while real people work for a living." Thomas felt his chest tighten, not just from his medical condition, but from the rage building inside him. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his wheelchair, trying to maintain his composure. He had learned long ago that fighting only made things worse, but the disrespect cut deep into his soul. "I'm not pretending anything," Thomas managed to say, his voice strained from the effort of speaking while struggling to breathe. "I served my country with honor." The dark-haired man laughed loudly. "Oh, he talks. And what's with all that heavy breathing? Are you trying to make us feel sorry for you? Maybe you should try acting classes instead of sitting on street corners." A small crowd had begun to form around them, but still no one stepped forward to help. Thomas could see the mix of curiosity and discomfort on their faces. Some seemed sympathetic but were too intimidated by the well-dressed bullies to speak up. "You know what I think?" the blonde man continued, emboldened by the attention. "I think you're just another lazy person who doesn't want to work. Probably never even left this city, let alone served overseas." Thomas reached into his jacket pocket with shaking hands and pulled out his military identification card along with his Purple Heart medal, which he always carried. The medal was tarnished but still clearly visible, along with his discharge papers that documented his honorable service and medical retirement. "Here's your proof," Thomas said quietly, holding up the items for them to see. His breathing was becoming increasingly difficult as stress and anger combined to make his condition worse. The blonde man barely glanced at the documents before sneering. "Anyone can fake those things. You probably ordered them online or made them in your basement." His friends laughed at this comment, clearly enjoying the show they were putting on. The crowd around them had grown larger, but the atmosphere remained tense and uncomfortable. Several people had their phones out, though whether they were recording or calling for help wasn't clear. Thomas felt his vision starting to blur slightly as his oxygen levels dropped. The stress was making his breathing problems much worse, and he could feel his chest tightening with each labored breath. The plastic tubes in his nose seemed inadequate for the amount of air his damaged lungs needed. "Look, he's even faking a breathing problem now," the dark-haired man said mockingly. "What's next? Are you going to pretend to pass out for dramatic effect?" Thomas wanted to respond, wanted to defend himself and his service, but speaking was becoming increasingly difficult. Each word required effort that his compromised respiratory system struggled to provide. He was caught in a terrible situation where the stress of being attacked was making his medical condition worse, which in turn made him look more vulnerable to his tormentors. The oxygen tank beside his wheelchair continued its steady hiss, but Thomas worried it might not be enough. He had experienced breathing crises before, and he recognized the warning signs. His fingers fumbled for the emergency inhaler in his pocket, hoping to get some relief before the situation escalated further. The blond man noticed Thomas reaching for his medication and laughed again. Now he's going for props. This guy really knows how to put on a show. I wonder what other tricks he has in that bag of his. Thomas pressed the inhaler to his lips and took a measured puff, trying to get the medication into his damaged lungs. The familiar taste of the bronchodilator filled his mouth as he held his breath for as long as he could manage, hoping for some relief from the tightening in his chest. The blond man watched this with obvious amusement. "Oh, this is getting better and better. Now he's using medical props. I have to admit, this guy is committed to his act. Should we call someone?" A woman in the crowd whispered to her friend, but her voice was barely audible above the mocking laughter of the young men in suits. Thomas lowered the inhaler and tried to catch his breath, but the medication would take several minutes to take effect. His hands were trembling now, both from the medication and from the stress of the situation. He looked around at the faces in the crowd, searching for someone who might understand, someone who might help. Most people avoided his eyes, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation but unwilling to get involved. A few seemed genuinely concerned but appeared intimidated by the aggressive behavior of the well-dressed group. Thomas understood their reluctance. These men obviously had money and influence, while he was just a disabled veteran that many people preferred to ignore. "You know what I think we should do?" the dark-haired man said to his friends, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think we should report this guy to the police for fraud. He's obviously running some kind of scam here." "That's a great idea," the blond man agreed enthusiastically. "We could be doing a public service by exposing these fake veterans. Think about all the real heroes who might be getting less support because of fraudsters like this." Thomas felt a new wave of panic wash over him. The thought of being arrested, of having to explain his condition to skeptical police officers while struggling to breathe, was almost overwhelming. He had been through enough humiliation and bureaucratic nightmares dealing with the Veterans Administration without adding a false arrest to his troubles. "Please," Thomas managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. "I just want to go to my appointment. I'm not bothering anyone." The blond man leaned down closer to Thomas's wheelchair, his expensive cologne mixing with the antiseptic smell of the medical equipment. "But you are bothering us. You're bothering everyone here with your pathetic little performance. People work hard for their money, and you're trying to guilt them into giving it to you." A teenage girl in the crowd pulled out her phone and started recording, though she tried to be discreet about it. Several other people noticed and began doing the same, creating a digital record of the harassment that was unfolding. Thomas's breathing became more labored as the stress continued to build. His chest felt tight and heavy as if someone was sitting on it. The oxygen tank was working at its normal rate, but his damaged lungs couldn't process the air efficiently enough to keep up with his body's increasing demands. "Look at him," the dark-haired man said with disgust. "He's really going all out with this breathing thing. I bet he practiced this routine in front of a mirror." A middle-aged man in work clothes took a step forward from the crowd. "Maybe you guys should just leave him alone," he said quietly. "He's not doing anything to you." The blond man turned toward the worker with a condescending smile. "Oh, we have a hero here. Let me guess, you probably believe every sob story you hear too. People like you are the reason these scammers keep trying their tricks." The worker looked uncomfortable but stood his ground. "I just think everyone deserves to be treated with respect," he said. "Respect has to be earned," the blond man replied coldly. "And this guy hasn't earned anything except maybe an award for bad acting." Thomas tried to wheel himself away from the confrontation, but the crowd had formed a loose circle around them, and he couldn't find a clear path. Every time he tried to move in one direction, someone was standing in his way, though most seemed to be there out of curiosity rather than malice. His breathing was becoming increasingly desperate now. The combination of stress, anger, and physical exertion was pushing his compromised respiratory system beyond its limits. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and his lips were starting to take on a slightly blue tinge that indicated insufficient oxygen. "I think he's, actually having a problem," a woman in the crowd said with concern in her voice. The blonde man heard her comment and laughed. "Of course he's having a problem. He's running out of material for his act. When the fake breathing doesn't work, what's next? Maybe he'll pretend to pass out?" Thomas fumbled for his cell phone, thinking he might need to call for medical help. His vision was starting to blur around the edges, and he recognized the signs of a serious breathing crisis developing. The irony wasn't lost on him that the harassment was creating the very medical emergency these men claimed he was faking. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered to the ground beside his wheelchair. As he leaned over to try to retrieve it, the movement made his breathing even more difficult. The plastic tubes in his nose had shifted slightly, reducing the efficiency of his oxygen delivery. "Oops, there goes his phone," the dark-haired man said mockingly, probably calling his fake veteran buddies to come help him with his performance. Several people in the crowd bent down to help Thomas retrieve his phone, but the blonde man stepped forward aggressively. "Don't help him," he commanded. "Can't you see this is all part of his act? He drops the phone so sympathetic people will feel sorry for him and maybe give him money." The people who had been trying to help hesitated, clearly confused and intimidated by the man's aggressive behavior. Thomas was now leaning precariously from his wheelchair, trying desperately to reach his phone while struggling with each breath. A woman with gray hair finally ignored the blonde man's commands and picked up the phone, handing it back to Thomas. "Here you go, dear," she said gently, her eyes showing genuine concern for his condition. "Thank you," Thomas whispered, but the effort of speaking left him even more breathless. He could feel his heart racing as his body fought for the oxygen it desperately needed. The kind woman who had helped Thomas retrieve his phone stayed close to his wheelchair, her maternal instincts clearly activated by his obvious distress. She could see that his lips were turning a concerning shade of blue, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Should I call an ambulance?" she asked Thomas quietly, trying not to attract the attention of the hostile young men who were still making cruel comments. Thomas wanted to answer her, but speaking had become almost impossible. He managed a slight nod, though he worried about the cost of emergency medical care and the embarrassment of having paramedics arrive because of a harassment incident. The blonde man noticed the whispered conversation between Thomas and the elderly woman. "Oh, now he's recruiting accomplices," he announced loudly. "Lady, don't let him fool you. This is obviously a practiced routine designed to make people feel guilty." "You're wrong," the woman said firmly, surprising everyone with the strength in her voice. "This man is clearly having a medical emergency. Look at his color, he's not getting enough oxygen." The dark-haired man stepped closer to them both, his expensive suit and confident posture designed to intimidate. "And what makes you such a medical expert? Did you fall for this guy's act hook, line, and sinker?" "I'm a retired nurse," the woman replied calmly, though her hands were shaking slightly as she confronted the much larger men. "I've seen enough respiratory distress to know the real thing when I see it." This revelation caused a murmur to run through the crowd. Several people began looking more closely at Thomas, finally noticing the obvious signs of medical distress that the harassment had been masking. His rapid, shallow breathing, the blue tinge to his lips, and the way he was gripping his wheelchair all pointed to a genuine medical crisis. The blonde man seemed momentarily taken aback by the nurse's professional assessment, but quickly recovered his aggressive stance. "So what if he's having breathing problems? That doesn't prove he's a real veteran. For all we know, he has asthma or some other condition that has nothing to do with military service." Thomas tried once again to show his military identification and Purple Heart medal, but his hands were shaking so badly that he dropped them. The documents scattered on the ground around his wheelchair, and the medal bounced twice before coming to rest near the fountain. Several people in the crowd could now see the official military documents and the genuine Purple Heart medal. The reality of Thomas's service record was becoming undeniable, even to those who had initially been skeptical. A young man in college clothing picked up the Purple Heart and examined it carefully. "This looks real," he said, his voice carrying across the plaza. "My grandfather had one just like it from Vietnam." The dark-haired businessman snatched the medal from the student's hands. "Anyone can buy these things online," he insisted, though his voice lacked some of the earlier confidence. "Military surplus stores sell replicas all the time." "Give that back to him," the retired nurse demanded, her voice growing stronger. "That medal belongs to this veteran, and you have no right to touch it." The confrontation was escalating, and Thomas found himself caught in the middle of it while struggling to breathe. His oxygen tank continued its steady hiss, but it didn't seem to be enough anymore. The stress of the situation was overwhelming his already compromised respiratory system. A businessman in his 50s who had been watching from the edge of the crowd stepped forward. "I'm calling security," he announced, pulling out his cell phone. "This has gone far enough." The blond man turned toward him aggressively. "Security should be called on this fraud who's running a scam in broad daylight." "The only scam here is your harassment of a disabled veteran," the businessman replied firmly as he dialed. "You're creating a public disturbance and possibly causing a medical emergency." Thomas tried to use his inhaler again, but his hands were shaking so badly that he nearly dropped it. The retired nurse gently helped him steady it while he took another dose of medication. The concerned expression on her face told him that his condition was becoming serious. "His oxygen saturation is dropping," she said to anyone who would listen. "He needs medical attention immediately." The crowd was now clearly divided between those who supported Thomas and those who seemed influenced by the aggressive businessmen. The tension was thick in the air, and several people had their phones out recording the incident. "You're all being manipulated," the dark-haired man insisted loudly. "This is exactly how these scams work. They create a crisis situation to make you feel sorry for them, then they'll ask for money or special treatment." A woman with a young child pulled out her wallet. "Even if you're right, which I don't think you are, this man clearly needs help right now. Whatever his story is, he's having trouble breathing." The blond man moved to block her approach to Thomas. "Don't encourage this behavior. If you give him money, you're just enabling fraud and making it harder for real veterans to get the help they deserve." The situation was becoming increasingly chaotic as more people began choosing sides. Some were clearly sympathetic to Thomas's obvious medical distress, while others seemed swayed by the businessman's confident assertions about fraud. Thomas felt his world starting to spin slightly as his oxygen levels continued to drop. The familiar feeling of panic that accompanied his breathing crises was making everything worse. He knew from experience that stress and anxiety only made his condition more dangerous. The retired nurse had positioned herself protectively near Thomas's wheelchair, trying to shield him from the worst of the harassment while monitoring his condition. "Someone needs to call 911 right now," she said urgently. "This man is going into respiratory failure." "Respiratory failure, right on cue," the blond man said sarcastically. "What an amazing coincidence. I suppose next he'll conveniently lose consciousness just when the cameras are rolling." Despite his cruel words, several people in the crowd were clearly becoming alarmed by Thomas's deteriorating condition. His breathing had become labored, to the point where even those without medical training could see that something was seriously wrong. A security guard from a nearby building had noticed the commotion and was walking toward them. Though he was still too far away to understand what was happening, Thomas hoped that official intervention might end the harassment. But he worried about trying to explain the situation while struggling to breathe. The dark-haired businessman noticed the approaching security guard and seemed to become more aggressive, as if he wanted to make his point before authority figures arrived. "Everyone here needs to understand that they're being manipulated by a professional con artist." Just as the security guard was approaching and the situation seemed ready to explode into complete chaos, a commanding voice cut through the noise of the crowd like a blade through silk. "Attention!" The single word was delivered with such authority and precision that everyone in the plaza immediately fell silent. Even the aggressive businessmen stopped their harassment and turned to see who had spoken with such commanding presence. Standing at the edge of the crowd was a tall figure in an immaculate red uniform with gold braiding and pristine white gloves. His black bearskin hat added to his imposing height, and his polished boots gleamed in the morning sunlight. Every detail of his appearance spoke of military precision and royal tradition. The man was clearly a member of the Queen's Guard, though what he was doing in this downtown plaza was unclear. His uniform was perfect, his posture ramrod straight, and his eyes surveyed the scene with the trained assessment of a professional soldier. The crowd parted instinctively as he walked forward, his measured steps echoing off the concrete. His presence commanded respect in a way that transcended civilian authority. This was someone who represented centuries of military tradition and honor. The blonde businessman attempted to regain control of the situation. "Sir, we're dealing with a fraud here. This man is pretending to be a disabled veteran to get sympathy and money from people." The guard stopped directly in front of Thomas's wheelchair and looked down at the struggling veteran. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes took in every detail. The oxygen tank, the military identification scattered on the ground, the Purple Heart medal still clutched in the dark-haired man's hand, and most importantly, Thomas's obvious respiratory distress. "Guardsman Williams," he said, introducing himself with crisp formality while looking directly at Thomas. "Royal Regiment."
"And you are?"
Thomas tried to speak but could only manage a whisper between labored breaths. "Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Matthews, United States Marine Corps, retired." The guard's expression softened almost imperceptibly as he recognized the genuine military bearing in Thomas's response, despite his medical distress. He had served alongside American forces in multiple deployments and knew the character of real soldiers when he saw it. "Gunnery Sergeant," Williams acknowledged with a slight nod of respect. "I can see you're in distress, may I?" He gestured toward the scattered military documents. Thomas nodded gratefully, and the guard knelt down with practiced military precision to gather the scattered papers. As he did so, he examined them with the trained eye of someone who knew genuine military documentation when he saw it. The blonde businessman tried to interrupt. "Those are obviously fake. Anyone can—" "Silence," Williams commanded without looking up, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The businessman immediately stopped talking, clearly intimidated by the guard's presence. Williams stood up and carefully examined Thomas's Purple Heart medal, which he firmly but politely took from the dark-haired man's grasp. His trained eye immediately recognized the authentic weight, craftsmanship, and aging of a genuine military decoration. This Purple Heart was awarded for wounds received in action against an enemy of the United States, Williams said formally, reading the inscription. "Gunnery Sergeant Matthews, Afghanistan, 2018. He looked up at the crowd. "This is not a replica. This is genuine military decoration, earned through sacrifice and service." The dark-haired businessman shifted uncomfortably but tried to maintain his position. "But how do we know he didn't buy it from a real veteran? People sell their medals all the time." Williams turned toward the man with the full weight of his authority. "Sir, I have served in Afghanistan alongside United States Marines. I have seen the wounds that improvised explosive devices inflict on soldiers. I have attended the medical evacuations and witnessed the long-term care required for such injuries." He paused and looked back at Thomas, whose breathing remained labored despite the gradual calming of the situation. This man bears all the signs of genuine respiratory damage consistent with blast injuries. His oxygen dependency, his breathing patterns, his physical responses, these cannot be faked. The retired nurse nodded in agreement. "Thank you for saying that. I've been trying to tell everyone that this man needs immediate medical attention." Williams acknowledged her with a respectful nod. "Ma'am, you're absolutely correct. Gunnery Sergeant Matthews is experiencing what appears to be stress-induced respiratory crisis, likely exacerbated by the harassment he's been enduring." The crowd was now completely silent, listening to every word from the guard. His professional assessment carried weight that no civilian opinion could match. The businessman who had been recording with his phone was still holding it up, but now the video was capturing a very different narrative. Williams turned back to the two aggressive businessmen, and his expression hardened noticeably. "Gentlemen, what you have done here today is unconscionable. You have harassed a disabled veteran who was simply trying to go about his business. Your behavior has directly contributed to his medical crisis." The blonde man tried to defend himself. "We were just trying to expose what we thought was fraud. There are so many fake veterans these days." "Are you military personnel?" Williams interrupted sharply. "No, but then you are not qualified to assess the authenticity of military service or disabilities," Williams stated firmly. "Your assumptions have been proven wrong. and your actions have been harmful to a fellow serviceman." The dark-haired businessman looked around nervously as he realized that public opinion had completely shifted against them. The crowd that had been watching with uncertainty was now looking at them with obvious disapproval. "We didn't know," he said weakly. You thought incorrectly," Williams cut him off. "And your ignorance does not excuse your behavior. This man has served his country with honor and sacrificed his health in defense of freedom. He deserves respect, not harassment." Thomas was beginning to breathe a little easier as the stress of the confrontation diminished, though he was still clearly in medical distress. The presence of a fellow serviceman who understood his situation had provided emotional relief that was helping his physical condition. Williams knelt down beside Thomas's wheelchair again. "Gunnery Sergeant, do you need medical assistance? I can call for emergency services." "I think I'm okay now," Thomas managed to say, though his voice was still strained. "Thank you for understanding. Most people don't know about blast injuries. I've seen too many good soldiers struggle with invisible wounds," Williams replied quietly. "Your service and sacrifice are recognized and honored." The security guard from the nearby building finally reached the group, but the situation had clearly been resolved by Williams' intervention. The crowd was beginning to disperse, though many people approached Thomas to offer apologies and support. The security guard, a middle-aged man with a friendly face, approached the group cautiously. He had witnessed the tail end of the confrontation and could see that the situation had been resolved, but he wanted to make sure everyone was safe. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, looking between Williams and Thomas. "The situation is under control," Williams replied formally, "though you may want to make note of this incident, in case there are any future problems with these individuals harassing veterans or other vulnerable people in this area." The security guard glanced toward the two businessmen, who were now standing awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, clearly wanting to leave but unsure if they should. Their earlier confidence had completely evaporated under Williams's professional authority and the obvious disapproval of the crowd. Several people were now approaching Thomas with genuine concern and offers of help. A young woman offered him water, while an elderly man shared his own story of military service and thanked Thomas for his sacrifice. The contrast between this genuine support and the earlier harassment was stark and emotional. "Gunnery Sergeant," Williams said quietly, "would you like me to escort you to your destination? I'm off duty and would be honored to ensure you reach your appointment safely." Thomas looked up at the guard with gratitude that went beyond words. After years of struggling with skepticism and bureaucratic indifference, to be recognized and respected by a fellow serviceman meant everything to him. "That's very kind of you," Thomas replied, his breathing continuing to improve as the stress subsided. "I have an appointment at the Veterans Affairs office just 2 blocks from here." Williams nodded approvingly. "A worthy destination. I know the way." As Thomas began to wheel himself forward, Williams fell into step beside him, his precise military bearing creating a protective presence that discouraged any further harassment. The crowd parted respectfully as they moved through the plaza. The retired nurse who had helped Thomas earlier caught up with them. "Excuse me," she said to Williams. "I wanted to thank you for intervening. I've been a nurse for 40 years and I could see that this man was in genuine medical distress. Those men were making his condition worse with their accusations. Ma'am, your medical assessment was correct, and your willingness to help a stranger in need speaks well of your character." Williams replied courteously. "Healthcare professionals like yourself often understand invisible wounds better than the general public." Thomas turned to the nurse as well. "Thank you for standing up for me when no one else would. Your medical expertise probably saved me from a serious breathing crisis." The nurse smiled warmly. "That's what we do. Take care of yourself and thank you for your service." As they continued walking, Williams maintained his protective position beside Thomas's wheelchair. His presence seemed to create a bubble of respect around them. People moved aside politely, and several veterans in the area nodded respectfully when they recognized the military bearing of both men. "May I ask what branch you served in?" Thomas inquired as they walked. "Grenadier Guards," Williams replied. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. I've had the honor of serving alongside Marines on several occasions. Outstanding soldiers, everyone. What brings you to this area today?" Thomas asked. "If you don't mind me asking." Williams smiled slightly. "I was visiting a fellow veteran at the hospital nearby. He's struggling with similar respiratory issues from blast exposure. When I saw what was happening to you, I couldn't stand by and watch a fellow serviceman be harassed. Thomas felt a deep connection with this man who had understood his situation immediately and intervened without hesitation. It was the kind of brotherhood that existed among those who had served in combat, regardless of nationality or specific military branch. Behind them, the two businessmen were finally leaving the plaza, but not before several people in the crowd had captured their faces and behavior on video. The footage would soon find its way to social media, where their actions would be widely condemned. Those men learned an important lesson today, Williams observed. Though I suspect they'll be more careful about their assumptions in the future. I hope so, Thomas replied. But I've encountered this kind of skepticism before. Many people don't understand that military injuries aren't always visible. They expect veterans to look a certain way or fit their preconceived notions. Williams nodded knowingly.
Invisible wounds are often the most challenging to bear, precisely because they're not understood by those who haven't experienced them.
But they're no less real or deserving of respect. As they approached the Veterans Affairs building, Thomas could see other veterans entering and leaving. Some were in wheelchairs. Others walked with canes or prosthetics, and many appeared outwardly healthy, but carried their own invisible burdens from their service. "This is my stop," Thomas said as they reached the entrance. "I can't thank you enough for what you did back there. You turned one of the worst experiences I've had in years into something that restored my faith in human decency." Williams extended his white-gloved hand for a firm handshake. "Gunnery Sergeant Matthews, it was my honor to assist a fellow warrior. Your service and sacrifice deserve recognition, not harassment. I hope your appointment goes well. Would you mind if I asked for your contact information?" Thomas inquired. "I'd like to stay in touch and perhaps I could introduce you to some local veterans who might benefit from meeting someone who understands their experiences." Williams reached into his pocket and produced a simple business card with his contact information. "I would welcome the opportunity to connect with other veterans in this area. We need to look out for each other." As Thomas wheeled himself toward the building entrance, he turned back one more time. "Guardsman Williams, you saved more than just my breathing today. You saved my dignity and reminded me why I was proud to serve in the first place." Williams snapped to attention and delivered a crisp military salute, which Thomas returned with as much precision as he could manage from his wheelchair. The symbolic exchange represented not just mutual respect between soldiers, but the broader brotherhood that transcends nationality and service branch. Several other veterans entering the building witnessed this exchange and paused to show their own respect. One elderly Korean War veteran removed his cap and placed it over his heart, while a younger female veteran who had served in Iraq nodded approvingly at the display of military courtesy. The moment served as a powerful reminder that true honor and respect come from understanding, empathy, and the willingness to stand up for those who have sacrificed in service to their country. 3 weeks after the incident in the plaza, Thomas sat in his small apartment reviewing the flood of messages that had come in since the video of his harassment and Williams's intervention had gone viral on social media. The footage, captured by multiple witnesses, had been shared thousands of times and generated an overwhelming response of support. His phone rang, and he recognized the number as belonging to a local news station. Over the past weeks, he had received calls from reporters, veteran advocacy groups, and even some government officials who had seen the video and wanted to help address the issues it highlighted. "Mr. Matthews," the reporter said, "we'd like to do a follow-up story on your experience and how it's brought attention to the challenges faced by veterans with invisible disabilities. Would you be willing to participate?" Thomas had been hesitant about media attention initially, but he realized that his story could help other veterans who faced similar skepticism and harassment. "Yes, I think that would be helpful, but I'd like Guardsman Williams to be included if possible. He's the real hero of this story." "Absolutely. We've already spoken with him and he's agreed to participate. We're also hoping to interview some of the other people involved, including the nurse who helped you." The response to the video had been overwhelmingly positive, but it had also revealed how widespread the problem was. Hundreds of veterans had shared their own stories of being questioned about the authenticity of their service or their disabilities. Many described feeling isolated and misunderstood by a society that expected their wounds to be visible. Thomas had started a correspondence with Williams, and they had met several times to discuss ways they could help other veterans in similar situations. Williams had been surprised by the intensity of the public response, but pleased that it was bringing attention to important issues. A knock at Thomas's door interrupted his thoughts. He wheeled over and opened it to find Williams standing in civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple button-down shirt that made him look younger and more approachable than his formal uniform had. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," Williams said. "I was in the neighborhood visiting another veteran, and I wanted to check on how you're handling all this attention." "Please come in," Thomas replied, gesturing him into the modest apartment. "I was just thinking about how much has changed since that day in the plaza." Williams looked around the apartment and noticed the military memorabilia on the walls, photos of Thomas with his Marine unit, citations for valor, and a flag that had clearly been folded with military precision. It was the home of a man who remained proud of his service despite the challenges he faced. "Have you seen the latest news about those two businessmen?" Williams asked as he took a seat on the couch. Thomas shook his head. "What happened?" "It turns out their employer saw the video and was not pleased with how they represented the company. Both have been terminated, and the company has made a substantial donation to veteran support organizations as an apology for their employees' behavior." Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions about this news. While he didn't wish unemployment on anyone, he hoped the consequences would make others think twice before harassing vulnerable people. "There's something else," Williams continued. "I've been contacted by several veteran advocacy groups who want to use our story to launch a campaign about invisible disabilities and the respect owed to all veterans, regardless of how their wounds manifest." "What kind of campaign?" Thomas asked with interest. "They want to create educational materials for the public about military injuries and disabilities that aren't immediately obvious. They also want to train business employees and security personnel on how to respectfully interact with veterans who may have invisible wounds." Thomas was intrigued by the possibility of turning his negative experience into something positive that could help others. "That sounds like it could make a real difference. Too many people have preconceived notions about what a disabled veteran should look like." Williams nodded in agreement. "I've been thinking about it, and I believe we have an obligation to use the platform this incident has given us to help other veterans. We can't let this opportunity go to waste." "What would be involved?" Thomas asked. "They want us to speak at events, participate in training sessions, and help develop educational materials. It would mean sharing our story publicly and probably dealing with more media attention." Thomas considered this carefully. Public speaking had never been easy for him, and his breathing problems made it even more challenging. But he thought about all the veterans who had reached out to him with their own stories of harassment and discrimination. "I'll do it," Thomas decided. "If our experience can help even one veteran avoid what I went through, it will be worth it." William smiled with genuine admiration. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already committed to participating, but I wanted to make sure you were comfortable with the idea before we moved forward." Over the next hour, they discussed the details of the proposed campaign and how they could most effectively share their message. Williams had already been in contact with several organizations, and there was significant interest in having them speak at veteran events, business conferences, and even military training sessions. "There's one more thing," Williams said as he prepared to leave. "The veteran I was visiting at the hospital the day we met, he saw the video and wanted me to thank you. He said it gave him hope that people would start to understand what he's going through." Thomas felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with his breathing problems. "What's his situation?" "Similar to yours. Blast injuries that affected his lungs and mobility. He's been dealing with people questioning whether his injuries are real because he's young and doesn't look disabled. Your story helped him realize he's not alone." This revelation reinforced Thomas's decision to participate in the advocacy campaign. If sharing his experience could help fellow veterans feel less isolated and misunderstood, then the embarrassment and trauma of that day in the plaza would have served a meaningful purpose. "I'd like to meet him sometime," Thomas said. "Maybe we could form a support group for veterans dealing with invisible disabilities." William's face lit up with enthusiasm. "That's an excellent idea. I know several other veterans who might benefit from that kind of peer support. We could meet regularly and share strategies for dealing with public skepticism and other challenges." As Williams prepared to leave, Thomas felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since his medical retirement from the Marines. The incident that had initially left him feeling humiliated and defeated was transforming into an opportunity to serve his fellow veterans in a new way. "Thank you for everything you've done," Thomas said as they shook hands goodbye. "You didn't just help me that day. You've helped me find a new mission." Williams returned the handshake warmly. "Semper Fi, Gunnery Sergeant. We're just getting started." 6 months later, Thomas sat at the head of a conference table in a downtown hotel, looking out at an audience of business leaders, government officials, and veteran advocates who had gathered for the Understanding Invisible Wounds Symposium. His breathing was steady and controlled, supported by his portable oxygen concentrator, but his confidence had grown tremendously since that difficult day in the plaza. Williams sat beside him, still impressive in his dress uniform, which he wore for official speaking engagements. Together they had spoken at dozens of events, sharing their story and educating audiences about the challenges faced by veterans with invisible disabilities. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas began, his voice clear and strong, "6 months ago, I was just another veteran struggling to navigate daily life with disabilities that most people couldn't see or understand. Today I stand before you as proof that negative experiences can be transformed into positive change when good people choose to stand up and make a difference." The audience listened attentively as Thomas recounted the events in the plaza, emphasizing how Williams' intervention had not only resolved the immediate situation, but had sparked a broader conversation about respect and understanding for all veterans. "The harassment I experienced that day was not unique," Thomas continued. "We've since heard from hundreds of veterans who have faced similar skepticism and discrimination. Many have invisible wounds from their service, traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, respiratory damage from burn pits, hearing loss, and countless other conditions that aren't immediately apparent to casual observers." Williams took over the presentation, explaining how their advocacy work had led to concrete changes. Several major corporations had implemented new training programs for their employees on respectful interaction with customers who have disabilities. Security companies had updated their protocols to be more sensitive to the needs of veterans and disabled individuals. "The most rewarding development," Williams said, "has been the creation of support groups in 12 cities across the country. Veterans with invisible disabilities now have places where they can connect with others who understand their experiences and challenges." In the audience, Thomas could see the retired nurse who had helped him that day in the plaza. She had become involved in their advocacy work and had helped develop medical education materials for first responders and healthcare workers who treat veterans with blast-related injuries. Also present was the young college student who had picked up Thomas's Purple Heart and confirmed its authenticity. He had been so moved by the experience that he had changed his major to social work with a focus on veteran services. The businessman who had called security during the harassment incident had also become an unexpected ally. His company had hired several disabled veterans and had become a model for inclusive workplace practices. He often spoke alongside Thomas and Williams about the importance of corporate social responsibility. "Our message today is simple," Thomas said, as the presentation neared its conclusion. "Veterans who have served their country deserve respect and understanding, regardless of whether their wounds are visible. But this principle extends beyond veterans. All people with disabilities, whether from military service, accidents, illness, or birth, deserve to be treated with dignity," Williams added. "The gentleman who intervened when I was being harassed did something that anyone can do. He chose to stand up for someone who couldn't defend himself. He didn't ignore the situation or assume someone else would handle it. He took action, and that action changed lives." The applause that followed was sustained and enthusiastic. During the question and answer session, several audience members shared their own stories of encounters with disabled veterans and asked for guidance on how to be more supportive and understanding. A representative from the Department of Veterans Affairs announced that their advocacy work had influenced new policies for processing disability claims, with particular attention to conditions that might not be immediately obvious during evaluations. After the formal presentation, Thomas was approached by a young woman in military uniform. "Gunnery Sergeant Matthews," she said, introducing herself as Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Army National Guard. I wanted to thank you for what you're doing. I have a traumatic brain injury from a roadside bomb in Syria, and people often question why I need accommodations because I look fine on the outside. That's exactly why we do this work, Thomas replied warmly. Have you heard about our support groups? We have one starting next month in this area. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's eyes lit up. I'd love to participate. I've felt so isolated since my injury. It would be amazing to connect with others who understand. Williams joined their conversation and provided her with contact information for the local support group coordinator. These personal connections were always the most meaningful part of their advocacy work. Knowing that their efforts were directly helping, individual veterans felt better than any award or recognition. As the event concluded, Thomas reflected on the incredible journey that had begun with such a painful experience. The harassment in the plaza had initially left him feeling demoralized and defeated, but Williams's intervention had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed both of their lives. Their partnership had evolved into a deep friendship, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to helping other veterans. They spoke regularly, not just about their advocacy work, but about their personal struggles and triumphs as they navigated life with invisible disabilities. The support groups they had helped establish were thriving, providing veterans with safe spaces to share experiences and coping strategies. Many participants reported feeling less isolated and better equipped to handle public skepticism about their disabilities. Educational initiatives they had supported were reaching thousands of people, from elementary school students learning about respect and inclusion to corporate executives developing more inclusive workplace policies. Ready to head home? Williams asked as they packed up their presentation materials. Actually, Thomas said with a smile, I was thinking we should stop by the plaza on our way. I haven't been back there since that day. Williams looked at him with understanding. Are you sure? That might bring back difficult memories. I think it will bring back the memory of when you stepped in and changed everything, Thomas replied. I want to see that place where our mission began. 20 minutes later, they stood together in the same plaza where their paths had first crossed. The fountain still bubbled peacefully, and people moved through the space going about their daily business, unaware of the significant events that had unfolded there months earlier. You know what I realized? Thomas said as they watched the normal flow of urban life around them. That terrible day was actually one of the best things that ever happened to me. Not because of the harassment, but because it brought us together and gave us a purpose bigger than ourselves. Williams nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become catalysts for the most meaningful work we can do. Your courage in sharing your story has helped more veterans than we'll ever know. As they prepared to leave, Thomas took one last look around the plaza. A year ago, this place had represented humiliation and despair. Now it symbolized hope, friendship, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. The two veterans walked away together, their friendship forged in crisis, but strengthened through shared purpose. Behind them, the plaza continued its quiet function as a gathering place for the community, but it would always hold special significance as the birthplace of a movement that had touched countless lives and reminded everyone that true honor comes from standing up for those who need it most.